Daniel chapter 6, the book of Daniel, and another famous story about Daniel and his time. The writing is on the wall. His three friends have been thrown into a fiery furnace. He was challenged with kashrut and managed to make it out healthier than everybody else. But perhaps the most famous is this chapter. V'daryavesh mada'a kabel malchuta kvar shinin shitin v'tartin. Darius the Medite received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So Darius here is old when he gets the kingdom. And you have to wonder whether here it's sort of talking about Daniel. This is a challenging thing. Daryavesh is after Cyrus. Daniel is already an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar already from presumably around the year 597. Darius is around the year 520 or so. So Daniel in this chapter is a very, very old man. Shvar kadam Daryavish v'akim malchuta lachtabarnya mea ve'esrin dilahun b'chol malchuta. Please, Darius, to appoint over the king 120 satraps, whatever that is, to be in charge of the whole kingdom. I'm just continue with a little bit of the English. We said, instead of the Aramaic, here again, the Aramaic, we're in Bavel, we're in Babylon. This is the language that's spoken. It's a book of the diaspora. Over them were three ministers. One of them was Daniel, to whom these satraps reported in order that the king not be troubled. Not surprised that Daniel is one of them. Daniel is a person who showed his wisdom to Nebuchadnezzar, showed his wisdom to Belshazzar, with the night when Belshazzar and the Babylonian kingdom was destroyed. Okay, and then we have Daryavish. Daryavish would be after Cyrus, after Koresh. So one of them was Daniel. And in verse 4, the man Daniel surpassed the other ministers, and we'll just call them advisors, by virtue of his spirit, and the king considered setting him over the whole kingdom. No surprise there, having seen what we've seen about Daniel. The ministers and advisors looked for some faults in Daniel's conduct in matters of state, but they could find neither fault nor corruption, as much as he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. They looked and they looked and they found, but he scraped. He got a guy who was able to scrape his entire social media presence from the internet completely. Nobody had anything to say about him. And continuing in verse 6, Edian Guvaria Ilach Amar Dilo Nashkachach Daniel Dilakil Ilah Nashkachna Lohai Bidat Elohei. They said we're not able to find anything against Daniel unless we find something about him and his connection with his God, as he is part of a minority, part of the Jewish people. And so the ministers and the advisors, they come thronging into the king and say, Darius, live forever. And all the ministers of the kings and the prefects and the advisors and the companions and the governors, right? Everybody together in agreement that a royal ban should be issued under sanction of an oath that whoever shall address a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into the lion's den. And so the king, as often happens, we see a lot about Achashverosh listening to his ministers, he puts a ban on the king. He puts a ban, right? And so it's going to be laws, and they cannot be abrogated. Of course, we see this again in the book of Megillat Esther, when Mordechai and Esther come to the king and say, get rid of the decree that the anti-Semites, the Jew haters, can come and destroy a Jew on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And the king says, once a law has been passed, it cannot be stopped. And so they say, make a law that cannot be stopped. And King Darius does it in verse 10. He puts a ban on in writing. And when Daniel learned that it had been put into writing in verse 11, he went to his house, in whose upper chamber he had his windows made facing Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he knelt down, he prayed, and he made confession to his God as he had always done. And here, this is a very important verse. I believe this is the first place where we see a Jew praying 3 times a day. The Gemara is going to talk about whether it comes from the patriarchs, whether it comes from the sacrifice. It's a whole debate. We say it was instituted by the patriarchs, but we do the timing based upon the sacrifice. Gemara Masechet Brachot. Jew praying to Jerusalem in a speech when he built the Beit HaMikdash. Shlomo said about everybody turning to this place, not just with sacrifice, but in prayers. But this is the first person we see doing that, something that, of course, is such a staple of Jewish communities worldwide. Daniel is the first. Daniel, we've talked about his importance, his significance, the only character who is challenged with eating non-kosher, a person who brings Kiddush Hashem outside of the land of Israel, gets Nebuchadnezzar to recognize God and to praise God. Nebuchadnezzar, the destroyer of the Beit HaMikdash. And so we see here very often Daniel is a very, very important character, and he does this. And if you look at the end of verse 11, what does it say? He does it even as he had always done it before. He doesn't care that there has been a decree. He does it. Now he does it partially in private, up in his windows. You could say maybe they're watching him in his windows. And of course, in verse 12, the men came thronging in and found Daniel praying to his God in supplication. And they went to the king and they reminded him of the royal ban. The king must be drunk at all times, doesn't remember anything. Then they say, did you not put a ban that whoever addresses or petitions any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days will be thrown into the lion den? And the king said, the order stands firm as a law of parasu madai that cannot be abrogated. Dilo tadei, or as we have it in Nasher lo ya'avor, right, over in the book of Megillat Esther. And so what do the men say to him in verse 14, Pasuk Yudal? They say, Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, or to the ban that you put in writing. 3 times a day he prays to his God. Upon hearing this, the king, what happens? The king is very upset. He's disturbed. And he wants to save Daniel. Daniel is a great advisor to him. Daniel's a brilliant guy who's done so much for these kingdoms. And he thinks day and night, how can he rescue Daniel? And the men come in and they say, King, these are the laws of Parasu Madai. And anybody who violates the king, right, needs to be, the king's decrees needs to be punished. And we can't do anything about it. We can't change it. The end, the words at the end of verse 16, lo lehashniya, right? Lehashnaya. We can't mishana, no shinoi, no changing it, no exceptions. And so by the king's order, Daniel was brought and he's thrown into the lion's den. And the king says to Daniel, in the end of verse 17 in the Aramaic, Elohach di'ant palach le bit dira hu yishezav vinach. The king, he says to him, your God who you serve regularly will deliver you. And again, a moment of Daniel bringing a belief, it seems, in one God and the supremacy of the God of Israel, the creator of the world, to the fore. A rock was brought in verse 18 and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with a signet and with the signet of his nobles so that nothing might be altered considering Daniel. The king went into his palace and spent the night fasting. And nobody came, and his sleep fled from him. He was sad, he was upset. And at first light, the king arose and rushed down to the lion's den. And as he approached the den, he cried to Daniel in a mournful voice. The king said, Daniel, Daniel. I'm going to read it from the Hebrew, V'amar, or Aramaic, in verse 21, Daniel, Daniel, Aved Elohachaya, Elohach di'ant palachle, b'tdira hechal shuvataich, tach min aryavata. He says, Daniel, was your God who you serve regular able to deliver you from the lion's den in 22? Edayin Daniel imalka malil, malka la'al min chayim. And what Daniel says, King, live forever. My God sent his angels, shut the mouth of the lion so they did not injure me. I'm innocent by him. I have done nothing wrong, O king. And the king was very glad and ordered Daniel in verse 24 be taken out of the den. Daniel's taken out of the den, and there is not, as it says, like with Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, his hair, no hair is singed, it says by them, by the fiery furnace. Nothing has happened. He hasn't been scratched, even like he had a house cat. And so what happens, verse 25, the king, what does he order? The men who slandered Daniel be brought in with their children and their wives, perhaps a little excessive, and were thrown into the lion's den. They hardly reached the bottom of the den when the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. And the king Darius wrote to all the people and nations and the language that inhabit the earth, may your well-being abound. And so he gives an order throughout his kingdom that must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God who endures forever. His kingdom is indestructible, his dominion is to the end of time. He delivers and saves, he performs signs in verse 28 and wonders in the heaven and the earth, for he delivered Daniel from the power of lions. And then finally in verse 29, we're told, and I'll read the Aramaic, Daniel dinei hatzlach malchut Dariavish malchut koresh parsa. And Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Presumably Cyrus comes before Dariavish, and those who say maybe this is a different Cyrus, but Cyrus is the one who takes over from the Babylonians. But here we see Daniel is a person who brings a Kiddush Hashem to the world, who brings the recognition of God to the world, and a book about the many, many miracles that happen towards the Jewish people. Again, some important things here: 3 times a day, the idea of Daniel praying in the direction of Jerusalem, the idea of Daniel not being scared and publicly being willing to show his belief and strength for God. Daniel, by the time the story comes out, is understood as being a very old man, we would think, because right, it's many, many years earlier that he's um, that he serves Nebuchadnezzar. And so it's an important chapter and teaches us some important lessons. You could question Mendelssohn, right, who says faith in private, not in public, be a German in the street, be a Jew in the home. Daniel is not willing to hide his faith. He opens his windows, he lets everybody see him. In a sense, he's private, he's up in his attic, but it's like it's a public prayer. And one of the things that it demonstrates in this chapter as well is the king is not able to save Daniel. Even the king has it in his power. The king can pardon. That shows the strength that a king has. But the king cannot save Daniel. But God alone can save Daniel. And so a book demonstrating against some of the challenges Jews of diaspora face and how Daniel and in other chapters his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, don't cower. They're not scared. They stand up for what they believe in. And at least in this book, they are rewarded and strengthened by their faith in God.